Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
A few lectures ago, I mentioned the strange input data. Now, what do I mean by input data? Let me explain this, and at the same time, let's also improve our look of this app, at least a little bit. And for that, we'll actually create a new widget. A widget which should wrap this question text here. Now, to create such a new widget, we can simply add a new class. Now, we can do this in the same file we previously worked in, but a good convention and rule is to only have one widget per file. There are rare exceptions to that rule. For example, if you have two widgets that really only work together and you don't really plan on reusing a widget in other files, but generally you want to have one widget per file. And therefore here I'll add a new file next to the main Dart file and I'll name it question.dart. And this should hold my question widget. Now you should actually, thanks to the Flutter extension which you installed, have a little helper here. If you type st, you should normally get some suggestions to automatically create some widgets. So a little shortcut, a little code snippet, which was added by the Flutter extension in Visual Studio Code and in Android Studio. If you get that, you can select the Flutter stateless widget option here and hit enter, and you automatically get a new stateless widget created for you. All you have to do here is add a name for that widget, which in my case would be question here. Now, this is in the end a class extending stateless widget, and you already get that build method with the override annotation, and it's the exact same widget setup we manually created at the beginning of this module. Now, here we're using stateless widget, and that is provided by the material file from the Flutter package, just like widget and build context and this container thing, which we haven't used before. And therefore, we have to add an import at the top of the file, which points at a package, and there at the Flutter package with /material_dart, so at that material_dart file. Now this is a valid widget. And there, let's get rid of container and let's add text here. And here I want to output the question text. The problem just is I'm managing my questions here in main Dart. Now, of course, we could move that questions list, or array as you could also call it. Array and list, these are interchangeable terms. You could move that list into the question widget. However, then you would have your list of strings in there, but the logic for changing the index resides in the main Dart file. Now, you could move that into the question widget as well, but we'll later also need it for our answer buttons, and actually already the answer buttons are in the main Dart file. We could move them into the question Dart file as well, but then we effectively would have moved basically everything from the main Dart file into the question Dart file, and that's not the idea behind splitting our app into widgets. So instead, what I want to do is I want to come back to that idea of getting some input data in a widget. And if you recall earlier lectures of this module, then you know that when you create a class, you can have a constructor which can take some data to initialize data inside of that class. And here the idea could be that we simply have our question text or whatever you want to name it. And since I don't initialize it with a default value here, I'll set this to type string to be clear about which type of data it will hold. And that question text should be passed into that widget kind of from outside, so from inside the place where we later use that question widget. For that, we can add a question constructor using the same syntax I showed you earlier, where you repeat the name of the class and then add parentheses. And then you can either use the long form with the curly braces, where you accept your arguments and then you store your arguments in properties of this class, or you use the short form where you add a semicolon after the constructor, and then you use this question text, and now the first argument, which is passed to the question constructor, will be stored in the question text property. Please note that I'm saying the first argument, because since I didn't wrap this here in curly braces in my argument list, this is not a named argument, but a positional argument. Only if I would wrap this in curly braces, it would be turned into a named argument. However, here, since I only need one argument, I'll go with a positional argument because identifying it shouldn't be too hard. It's the only one, right? So this is my positional argument which is required, which will be stored in the question text variable or property here. And now down there in the text widget, which expects a text, I can simply refer to question text. So to this property, I can refer to it down there. Now, how do we use this widget then? Let's go back to the main Dart file where we at the moment have our text widget here. And now I want to forward my selected question, which I select in the same way I did before, not to the text widget, but to my question widget instead. To do that, we first of all need to import our question widget from the question file. So we add a new import statement at the top. And the convention here is to first of all have a block of all the imports that point at packages, and then a block of imports that point at your own files. Here you add quotes, single quotes or double quotes, doesn't matter, just be consistent once you made your choice. And there you now add a relative import path, which means you add /, which means look in the same folder as the main Dart file is, and then the name of the file from which you want to import, which in this case is question Dart. So now we're importing from question Dart, and that means everything that's in this file is now available in the main Dart file as well, unless you name it with an underscore in front of the name. However, question doesn't have an underscore, and it shouldn't, because we want to be able to use the question widget in the main Dart file. So here we now can use question instead of text. And since question, its constructor, expects to get a value for the question text, we still need to pass a value to this question constructor. So this is already correct here in the main Dart file. Now, of course, you might wonder, what's the benefit of this? Previously, we used text. Now we use our own widget, but in there, we also just use text. Of course, for this simple restructuring, it's not too useful. Nonetheless, it is a good idea to split your widgets or your app into smaller custom widgets. That can help with performance because it can make your rebuilds more efficient, and it also makes it easier for you to manage your code. Of course, not that much if all we had here was a single text widget, but the more complex of a widget structure you had here, the leaner your main Dart file gets as soon as you move that into a separate widget. Again, not that useful for the single text widget, but we'll see the benefits more and more as we progress throughout the course. Now, that here is a stateless widget, that's important, and this now receives some input data because it gets some data in its constructor. Now, if we save that and we have a look at our app, it looks the same way as before, and conveniently, if we press answer 1, it also behaves the same way as before, and the text changes once we press that button. Now, this has one important implication. It means that what I mentioned on this slide is true. On the left side, on the stateless widget, it gets re-rendered when the input data changes. Now, that's exactly what's happening here. Here in main Dart, when we change the question index with setState, the build method gets called here, and therefore Flutter and Dart go through our widget tree. And in the end, they find out that for a question here, we are changing the text, right? Because question index changed because the index changed. So we select the second question in our list of questions now. So the input data to question changes, and therefore Flutter automatically calls build in the question widget here. Now, technically, it calls build for every widget here, but then the widget basically checks, did I change? And most widgets didn't change, but for the question widget, it now did change because it received a new text. And since it received a new text and was rebuilt with that new text, it also updates on the screen. So that is what Flutter does for us. We rebuild the stateless widget, not because it changed internally, it can't, it's stateless, but because the data from outside changed when the build method in main ran again. So that's what's happening here. Now, one syntax improvement which we should do here, because I'm already getting a warning here, this here is a property of the question widget, which, like this, could be changed internally. Now, of course, that wouldn't be reflected on the user interface as you learned, because it's stateless, but technically inside of the class you could change this, because there's a difference between the Dart features, and there in any class you can change data, and how Flutter uses that class. And that's what that warning tells us. This class is marked as immutable. That happens inside of the stateless widget in the end. And yet we have an instance field, which is in the end just a property, which is not final, which means it could be changed. You could change that string from inside that class. And therefore, it's a good convention and recommended that you add final in front of this property definition here. This tells Dart that this value will never change after its initialization here in the constructor. So this change doesn't count. That is okay. So when data is received here in the constructor, that will be stored in question text, because in the end, that all happens when this object gets created based on the class. The constructor, remember, gets called when the object is created. At this point of time, the data we receive in the constructor is stored in that property, so that is okay. But thereafter, once this object, and therefore this widget, is live, so to say, we can't reassign this. We can't assign a new value to question text. We didn't do that, but now we would get an error if we tried to. And that only makes sense because since it's a stateless widget, changing this wouldn't have any effect, and now we're really writing code that makes this super clear. So adding final here is a common thing you will see throughout this course and something you should add here. Now with that, we have the same behavior as before, but in our own widget. And our custom widgets will become more and more important the more complex our widget logic gets. We can already make this a bit more complex by adding our first little styling to this text. Thus far, we haven't really styled anything. Well, now we can do at least a little bit of styling here for our question text.